On Tuesday, November 26th at 10:22 a.m. EST, I texted one of my best friends saying, FNaF lore is breaking my brain. This never happens. Usually I can figure out ways for things to work, but this is breaking my brain. Help." That's right, guys. I had just finished writing my previous theory on refuting anti-Stitchline Games evidence, and was just beginning to work on this video, and as I thought about everything deeper, I just couldn't solve it. I was hoping as I wrote this video I would be able to come up with viable solutions for the problems, but I just couldn't. That's right, guys. After almost 6 years of being a FNaF theorist, it has finally happened. For the first time, I am completely stumped. And I need your help. My last theory video was all about Stitchline Games and how pretty much all of the evidence people use to claim Stitchline Games is false is a bit off and not very convincing, and there's usually explanations, but the biggest issue people have is the timing. The story The Mimic talks about how Edwin started his company in the early 70s about 5 years ago, placing the story in 1979 at the very latest. The Secret of the Mimic teaser also has the year 1979 in it, lining up perfectly. The main character in The Mimic is Edwin, and he is 24. However, the tale's story The Storyteller also follows Edwin, and he is supposedly 64, meaning there is a 40-year gap between The Mimic and The Storyteller, placing The Storyteller in 2019, meaning the Pizzaplex opened in 2019. However, the story Cleithrophobia has an opening scene in May, and then flashes backward 5 months to before the Pizzaplex even opened. The rest of the story takes place in the already finished Pizzaplex in December of 2018. The problem here is the timing. We all believed for a while that FNaF 3 and FNaF 6 were in 2023, but that can't be the case if this is true. FNaF 3 claims it is 30 years after Freddy's closed, and we previously believed that meant 30 years after FNaF 1 in 1993, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Not only is FNaF 1 probably not actually in 1993, but probably like 1989 or something, but that could also be referring to the first Freddy's, which closed in 1985, placing FNaF 3 in 2015, and that is the earliest it possibly can be, the year that the game actually released. And if the Pizzaplex opens as early as 2019, then it has to be the case, and FNaF 6 would probably also have to be. But even if FNaF 6 is as early as 2015, that still squeezes the entire Stitch line into, at most, 4 years. The events don't cause too many problems with that, but one line from one of the epilogues does. According to Larson in Epilogue 5, the FNaF 6 fire was so far in the past it was almost ancient history in the department. It was clearly a long time ago, and only 3 years wouldn't be that long ago, at least not long enough for it to be considered ancient history. Why 3 years instead of 4? Because of Into the Pit. In the Into the Pit game, there's actually an Easter egg of the Stitch Wraith. The Stitch Wraith is created from Fetch, who was infected by Andrew in the Man in Room 1280, which was after FNaF 6, and there are also pieces of trash in the gang and Happy Frog in the dumps of the game, meaning this game has to happen after the events of FNaF 6. In the Frights epilogues, the Stitch Wraith is claimed to have been spotted near the fire site, aka the FNaF 6 location, which means the Pizzaplex has not been built yet, and so these epilogues must be before the Storyteller. A calendar of August can also be seen on the wall in Oswald's school, with the month starting on Wednesday and ending on Friday. The only year that fits between 2015 and 2019 that matches this August calendar is 2018, in which case the Pizzaplex would have to be built really quickly, but believe me when I say, that's the least of the problems. In any case, Into the Pit, and by extension the rest of the Stitch line, has to take place in 2019, right? So, for context, in Security Breach, we can find magazines called Faz Life, a quarterly magazine, meaning 4 are released per year. The latest one we can find is volume 19, and doing a bit of quick math, we can find that the Pizzaplex has to have been open for at least 4.75 years. Faz Life doesn't have to have started immediately after the Pizzaplex opened, but the Pizzaplex can't really precede them. We already discussed the Pizzaplex being open in 2019, which means by the time of Security Breach, it has to be at least 2024. However, something else we can find in Security Breach is another calendar, one which doesn't line up with 2024. In fact, the earliest year later than 2019 that does align with the calendar is 2029. Other years like 2035 and 2046 also match the calendar. 2035 is the most common time people believe Security Breach to take place, but I've believed for a little while that 2029 probably works best. And yeah, it works for the most part. Earlier I said that Edwin was 64 in The Storyteller, making a 40-year gap between it and the Mimic, and there was actually a rumor a while ago that Edwin's age actually changed in digital copies of that book, and that he was instead 74, making it a 50-year gap and placing The Storyteller and by extension the opening of the Pizzaplex in 2029, which then places Security Breach in 2035, as that is the next year that fits the calendar. This is actually not true though, there was no change, but if there had been, it would be kinda helpful. It's honestly possible, due to the timeline just not adding up, that Edwin's age in The Storyteller is actually just a mistake. And knowing that would actually help a lot, and pushing the timeline back more explains some stuff. Say hypothetically, that was the case. It matches the Fred Masquerade picture with the year 2035, which is also the most common belief like I said, so it works well there. It gives much more time for the Pizzaplex to be built, and it also allows the Stitch line to happen later, making it more logical for FNaF 6 to be considered ancient history, right? Actually no, it does not. Earlier I mentioned the August calendar, how it matches 2018, allowing it to fit snugly between FNaF 6 and the opening of the Pizzaplex. Unfortunately, because of leap years, the next year that the calendar matches is actually 2029, which means Into the Pit has to either take place in 2018 or 2029. No years in between match, but it can't take place in 2029 because the Pizzaplex is already built by then. You may say the Pizzaplex is just built quickly and opens at the end of the year and the Stitch line happens earlier in the year, but there's two problems with that. First, Into the Pit is still in August, leaving only like 4 months for the Pizzaplex to be built. Technically it is possible, as in real life smaller things have been built in like a day, so a few months for the Pizzaplex is definitely a possibility, even though it is still a bit wild if that is the case. But the bigger problem is what I mentioned earlier. The Pizzaplex is open by May, and it's built by the December of the year before. There is no squeezing Into the Pit before the construction of the Pizzaplex, because the Pizzaplex is already built by the end of 2028, and Into the Pit would have to take place earlier than that. So it is forced to remain in 2018. But there's still problems there. First of all, the ancient history line. How does one solve that? Is it an exaggeration? Well, obviously, because it's not literally ancient history, but that still indicates it was many years ago, and much more than just 3. Sure, the Stitch line could have a bit more time to happen, but not much, since the Stitch Wraith is only created mere weeks before the epilogues start, and it already exists in Into the Pit, which happens in August of 2018. If the epilogues did span months, which they don't really seem to, it could extend into 2019, but probably not, so it doesn't add much anyway. But another big problem is that other sources indicate that Into the Pit takes place later than 2018. Many people dismiss the graphic novels as just being non-canon since the artists are given free will, but those artists are instructed to follow a script that is provided to them. The scripts come from elsewhere, so they are most likely accurate, or at least more accurate, especially since some things in them are deliberately changed. But why? Is it that Scott isn't the one supplying the scripts, or is it because it's just trying to get a certain point across? Because some of these things are just unnecessary, and the fact that they are changed makes it seem intentional. In Into the Pit, Oswald is a fan of a Godzilla ripoff called Zendrelix, and in the graphic novel, he talks about how Zendrelix 2020 is available now for streaming. And this isn't a situation like Blade Runner 2049 where it's just a sequel with the year it takes place in the title. This is a remake of the original movie, which indicates that it's the year that it came out, like with Dawn of the Dead remake or Resident Evil 1 remake. The year isn't a part of the title, you might just say remake when you're talking about it, or you'll say the year that it came out to specify which one you're referring to. If we assume the graphic novel isn't just lying to us, Into the Pit has to be later than 2020, but it has to be earlier than 2028, and there's no year within that range which the calendar in the game can match. And this is why I'm stumped. Into the Pit and the rest of the Stitch line has to either be in 2018 or 2029, but it has to be in a year spanning from 2020 to 2028. Even if we ignore the graphic novel though, it still can't be in 2029, because the Pizzaplex is already built and open, and if it's in 2018, then there's still the problem of the ancient history line, so there isn't an option which makes sense. You could say that the game is actually less accurate than the story, but you would expect the game to be giving accurate information, like the Stitch Wraith existing by this point, or the calendar, so it would be weird if it was just wrong. There's also the possibility of split-line games, the theory that there's a split in the timeline after FNaF 6, one timeline where the Pizzaplex begins construction right after FNaF 6 burns down, allowing only minimal time for police investigation of the fire, so they never find the puppet or Afton, leading to Tails, Security Breach, and Eleanor still being alive and probably a future villain, and another where there is no Pizzaplex and Afton and the puppet are found, leading to the Stitch line. The rationale here is that maybe Scott fully intended for this story to end after Ultimate Custom Night, then made the Stitch line just to tie up loose ends, as it was originally said to. Then Scott changed his mind and decided to continue the story but go a different direction. This would then allow Into the Pit to happen in 2029 or later, without the Pizzaplex restricting the timing. There's a couple problems though. Obviously the Pizzaplex opened in 2019, but like I've been saying, hypothetically, if it opened in 2029, it doesn't really have to have started construction all the way back in 2015. Without timeline restrictions, FNAF 6 could be moved to its release year of 2017, or even the original theory of 2023, in which case maybe it did start construction immediately, but it's not necessary. It's not really a point against it, it just doesn't need to happen. But more importantly, Eleanor. Both Lally's game and Frailty imply that Eleanor is still involved in the modern story of FNAF. If Splitline Games was the correct answer, that means we'd have an Eleanor that never got trapped in a memory. Yes, making it easier for her to come back, but that also means we have an Eleanor without any of her already established backstory. Sure, we know how it happened in one timeline, but we don't see how anything happened or even what exactly happened to this specific version of Eleanor. I'll give you guys a Resident Evil comparison for a second, because it's my favorite series and I like shamelessly promoting my non-FNAF streams and FNAF videos at any opportunity I can get, plus the comparison is pretty good anyway, so it's relevant. It's all but confirmed by now that we will be getting a remake of Resident Evil 5, in which Albert Wesker is the main villain, and a great villain at that. But one of the things that makes him so great is how he was set up with Resident Evil 1, 0, and Code Veronica, and separate ways in RE4. The remakes so far have included RE1, 2, 3, and 4, and 0 and Code Veronica were both released before RE4 and don't yet have remakes. However, RE1 Remake was also released before RE4, so while it would be strange to remake it again, and it definitely is a fantastic game, it's still very dated and it would be good to remake it again in an RE2 Remake style. But if they just jump straight to RE5 Remake before remaking RE1, 0, and Code Veronica, then that would be a big mistake. Same goes for Eleanor. Splitline Games being canon instead of Stitchline Games would be like if they jumped straight to RE5 without remaking RE1, 0, and Code Veronica first. Sure, the context of the villain does exist, but it's not from this timeline, and we don't see how it went down in this timeline, so it's just not nearly as effective. These things don't have very much evidence against them, and they could be true, it would just be really unsatisfying and a bit illogical if they were. And that's the main problem. There's not really any option that is satisfying based on evidence, logic, storytelling, and just the way FNAF historically works. I made this video talking about a hypothetical scenario where the Pizzaplex opened later than it actually does, and you may be wondering why I actually did that if it's not true. But my point is that even if the timeline is a little bit broken, there's not really a way of fixing it by pushing things back. That still causes problems unless you push it back way later, and by that point Edwin shouldn't even be alive by the time of the storyteller anyway, so the timeline just doesn't really add up, unless there's something else that can make the timeline work, but as of now I don't really see what that could be. Like, another option is just that the books and games really are separate timelines, but the problem with that is just everything else lines up so perfectly, and so much stuff implies that they are in the same timeline, especially the appearance of Tiger in Help Wanted 2, Edwin's robotic company, including his robotic vacuum in the Five Nights at Freddy's game, and that's not even mentioning the Secret of the Mimic trailer, which absolutely outright confirms that Tails is in the games. So at this point, I'd find it shocking and honestly kinda stupid if they aren't. No option satisfies everything, and believe it or not, Tails also throws another loophole into the mix, that being Gregory. It's a problem that can very easily be solved, but only by a theory everyone hates. Remember how I said the Pizzaplex opens in 2019 and Security Breach happens in 2029? That means there is a 10-year difference. In GGY, it is said that the first therapist that GGY saw had worked as a therapist for the past 3 years. However, the Pizzaplex wasn't open that long, as it was said to have only been open the last couple years. I usually take couple to mean 2, but the problem is still there if it's more than 2, as it can't be more than 3.5 years, because the only relevant therapists were the ones that started working during the Pizzaplex era, and the earliest therapist in that time span started 3 years and 5 months ago. The only reason the first therapist was relevant was because she worked within the past couple years. It's just that she also worked longer before that too. So the Pizzaplex must have opened at some point between 2 years and 3.5 years ago. What this means is that GGY, the story, takes place at the maximum 3.5 years after the Pizzaplex opened up. With the Pizzaplex opening in 2019, that places GGY in 2022 or 2023 if we're feeling generous. In the story, Gregory is 12 years old. If Security Breach takes place in 2029, the earliest that it can be, that makes Gregory at least 18 years old by then. But we play as Gregory in Security Breach, and I think it is very clear that he is not 18 years old. If anything, he is more likely 12 during the events of Security Breach, but no, he was 12 6 years prior. Hell, even if the Pizzaplex opened in 2029, he would be 16 still. And again, he is definitely younger than that. This is problematic for the timeline. The only real way this actually does work, the only way it's not an inconsistency, is if Gregory is a robot. And a lot of people hate the Gregbot theory, but in reality, it doesn't have that much evidence against it like some people say it does. I'm not gonna say I believe it, I don't really have an opinion on it, but it's not as far-fetched as people make it out to be, and it's really the only way to make the timeline work here. This is something I have discussed in past videos, such as my video on what the Mimic story actually means, so you can check that out if you'd like to. There is one other idea I have to fix the stitch line inconsistencies, but I think that has to wait for its own video. The point I'm trying to make in this video is that the books to me really do seem like they're in the games, but there's problems that come with that, and the answers to the problems are either controversial, unsatisfying, or baseless. It's easy for one to just assume the books aren't in the games, but to me, that doesn't at all seem like the route that was taken. I am also of the opinion that there is a solid story, and probably minimal inconsistencies, if any. There is probably a logical explanation for everything, it's just up to us to figure out what it is. So let me know in the comments what you guys think, and if you did enjoy this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye guys!